Thanks everyone for joining, and I'd like to welcome you to this Govern 365 and Risk New Zealand webinar with JP Castlin on risk in rigidity, exposing the flaws in traditional strategy. So really like to thank JP from joining from Sweden, where it's 11 p.m. at night there. Also, we've got David Turner, CEO from Risk New Zealand, and myself will be chatting with JP. So welcome David from Perth, which is 5 a.m. in the morning for him. If you've got any questions, just put them in the Q&A or chat, and I'll keep an eye on those, and we'll pick them up as we go along. Before I get started, I just wanted to share with you what Govern 365 does. Basically, we help simplify governance. It's essentially an organisational health check. We do an in-person evaluation with the board and exec, facilitating an organisational health check and ensuring alignment on where you are now. Then we help the group land on the top 2 to 3 organisational priorities to add value or reduce risk. And then we coach and support you to embed better practices and turn those actions into value. Alignment, focus, value. We're also running an initiative called Pay It Forward, where we're helping to get corporates to contribute 50% of the cost of the annual subscription of a charity, and Govern 365 will contribute the other 50% to go through the process for a year. So if you know of any corporates who would like to sponsor charities or charities that would benefit, I'll put the link into the chat. Hope it works this time. Didn't work last time. So let me just see if I can put that in the chat now. Everyone. Right, that's in the chat now. One of the areas we evaluate is strategy and enterprise risk. 2 areas actually, and the 2 areas we're going to explore today. So, got David Turner from CEO of Risk New Zealand. So he's one of we're partners with Risk New Zealand, and he'll be asking some of the more risk-related questions. Many organisations have a strategy. Is it really a strategy? Ones I've seen are more of a plan than a strategy. It's the difference. And do organisations understand enterprise risk? Again, I've seen many organisations with a risk register covering health and safety risks, which are more operational risks, but not enterprise risks. JP Castlin is a globally renowned expert in strategy, leadership, and organisational complexity. His career began as a lawyer, specialising in corporate governance, corporate finance, and M&A, before shifting into strategy and management consulting. Today, he has been dubbed a member of the Mount Rushmore of strategic management, and one of the industry's most important voices. He's also the creator of the ABCDE framework, an author, and an international keynote speaker. So welcome, JP. He's also got a book coming out at the end of the year called What to Do When You Don't Know What to Do, with a New Zealander called Steve McCrone, who's an expert on risk. So end of the year, beginning of next year, that book will be out. Welcome, JP. Fantastic to have you on the webinar, and thanks for coming late at night.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, and that surprisingly terse introduction.
So first up, I wanted to start with getting an understanding of what is strategy and what is not strategy. And you might want to elaborate in terms of good strategy versus bad strategy.
Sure. I mean, I think that those are perhaps 2 slightly different questions. So I'll attempt to answer both. So if we start with what strategy is and isn't, it kind of depends on who you ask. So this happens to be one of my favorite questions, so I've asked it a lot. And most commonly, I've found strategy is taken to mean either a plan, so a how, kind of a means of getting from here to there, right? It can be a pattern actions taken over time, what Mintzberg would call emergent strategy. It can be a position that reflects decisions to offer certain products or services in certain markets or certain customer segments, where you find someone like Porter, or it can be a perspective, so what you might call a vision or direction. Now, the interesting thing about all this is, if you think about it, and you look at these definitions sort of collectively, you realize that they're not just different, but they're actually so different to almost be each other's counterparts. So a plan is the result of direct control and deliberateness, sort of before the event, whereas a revealed pattern is the outcome of indirect control and something which can only really be observed after the fact. Now, A position, well, that's where you are, right? Well, a direction is indicative of where you want to be, and therefore, per definition, cannot be. So when we talk about strategy, the first thing organizations have to do is sort of establish what they actually mean before they start using the term. Now, if you were to ask me, I'm weird. So I consider strategy to be a framework that enables synchronization of adaptive units so that a company can move in a wanted direction at a desired tempo. And I know that's a bit of a mouthful, so I'll just briefly explain what I mean, right? So the first thing that a strategy is a framework. It's not just a decision, because everything is a decision, right? Including the decision not to make a decision. So it needs to be a framework. The other thing is that it should enable what I call the synchronization of adaptive units. So what does that mean, right? Well, in your organizations, you have employees, and employees are adaptive units. That is to say, they adapt to changes in their environment. And that's actually a good thing. They should do that. But you need to synchronize that adaptation. Otherwise, you often end up with behavior that is locally adaptive, but it's globally maladaptive. In other words, your teams may solve the challenges that they face, but they do so in a way that creates more challenges for everyone else in the organization, or sometimes vice versa. And then lastly, the net result out of all of this should be movement in a wanted direction at a wanted speed. And that is kind of self-explanatory. Now, in terms of the second part, good strategy, bad strategy, I mean, anything that fails to do that in my world is kind of a bad strategy. But whenever one uses those terms, good strategy, bad strategy, inevitably you end up with Richard Rumelt, who has written a book called that. And it's one of the most famous books in strategy. And what he tends to mean is that any strategy that doesn't solve a problem is a bad strategy. And it sounds reasonable enough, but the problem that I have with it is that, well, firstly, it assumes that you're dealing with a problem that can be solved in the first place, right? Which is not necessarily true for strategic problems. It also assumes that strategist is able to identify the problem as well as the solution and then convince everyone else that she is correct, right? And this is rarely the case. And then it assumes that we have unequal control. In other words, that we're able to say, if we just do this, then that will happen, that will be the solution, and that's never the case. And then lastly, I suppose, it kind of assumes that anything that produces a good result is good, and anything that fails to do so, it's bad, right? Where actually in reality, and this is true for, I suppose, most things, but a good strategy may actually produce a bad result because of, luck, essentially, right? Or bad luck. But similarly, a bad strategy may produce a good result because of good luck. So to illustrate, if you put your mortgage and your kids' college funds and your wedding rings, let's say, on a limp three-legged donkey winning the Kentucky Derby, that's not a good strategy, even if it somehow were to win, right? And if you don't believe me, go ask your partner, ideally wearing protective gear. But you get my point, right? And so that's sort of, I suppose, where I have an issue with the good strategy, bad strategy stuff. Again, I think the big thing is, was the intent such that we're moving in the right direction at the right speed? I hope that answers the two questions.
So for an average company, where would you start? So do you start with purpose? Do you start with vision? Do you start with values? Because all of these are bounded around.
Yeah.
What's your view in terms of just an average company? Where would you direct them to in terms of the framework to start?
So I would start with what I call the shared understanding of success, because that kind of sets the direction of the movement that I mentioned. And here you have three things in the shared understanding of success. So first, it needs to be understood. So not just defined. Sometimes when we talk about strategy, you have something which is easily defined and then people regurgitate it kind of, as if they were in school. But it needs to be understood. That needs to be shared. In other words, everyone should share that same understanding. And then it should involve some kind of measure of success, right? So the key here, and this is a bit of a challenge in practice, but the key is to find something that is sort of abstract enough that that is not necessarily set in time, that it remains relevant over time, rather. But it should be pragmatic enough that you may measure progress against it. So we can't have something like, let's say WeWorks, that their thing was elevating the world's consciousness, right? Okay, so you can't have that because one, no human being understands what that means, so the understanding can't be shared. But also, like, how do you actually measure that? How do you measure the altitude of the world's consciousness, right? So it needs to be a bit more pragmatic than that. But you need to start with that shared understanding of success because, again, it informs everything else. We call it aspiration in technical terms, but it's basically what it is.
And so, you know, is this what people would call a purpose, or is that different to a purpose? Is it more of the vision? So that's where people get confused about a vision and a purpose.
Uh, Out of the two, I'd say it's closer to a vision. Both terms in my book have issues. There's something called vision creep, which is when visions move towards that big purpose thing. Purpose has become an interesting one just because it tends to equate to a bunch of values that no one really believes in practice, or kind of, saving the world, and no one, like, if you go to buy toilet paper, right, you buy the stuff that you always bought. You don't go, well, actually this brand is just setting out to save the planet. It's just toilet paper, you know what I mean? And it's the same thing for organizations. So research has demonstrated quite clearly that the companies that are the most purpose driven and sort of wear their values on their sleeves are also the organizations that fail to live up to them in the eyes of their employees. And in reality, anyway, organizations get their values from employees, not vice versa. So I'm kind of skeptical of purpose.
Yeah, cool. David, do you want to ask around the enterprise risk?
Yeah, thanks, Gerry. JP, there's kind of two parts of the question. So the first part is, what do you define as enterprise risk versus operational risk? Because I see many companies with a risk matrix with health and safety risks or other operational risks not related to the strategy.
Well, starting there then, I mean, I need to emphasize that I'm not a risk expert by any stretch of anyone's imagination, including my own. But if we go by the ISO 31000 standard definition of risk, you're dealing with the effect of uncertainty and objectives. Then you might say that enterprise risk is the effect of uncertainty on broader enterprise objectives, the organization as a whole, I suppose. While operational risk is the effect of uncertainty on narrow operational objectives, and this can, of course, be anything from projects to ensuring that everyone stays healthy and safe. So the question is, okay, so why do we have risk matrices, for example, with the latter, not the former? And again, I can only speculate because this is not necessarily my field, but I would imagine that part of it has to do with the kind of uncertainty that you're facing, right? So in operations, you tend to be closer to the proverbial fray, and you see more repetition, and you can sort of learn more as you sort of go along. You know more about the context. So we get to something called aleatoric uncertainty. And aleatoric uncertainty is uncertainty that is probabilistic in a sense, right? So we don't know whether A, B, or C is going to happen. We can kind of calculate the probabilities of each, right? And we can't necessarily reduce the overall risk, but again, we can make those kinds of calculations. We can model it, we can understand it, and so on. So we can use a risk matrix then. If we're unable to use one, perhaps because we're dealing with something called epistemic uncertainty, which is uncertainty about the model itself, at least we can collect more data and get sort of a better understanding. Now in strategy, however, we tend to be dealing with the complexity and the complex, which means that we're dealing with a third kind of uncertainty, which is systemic uncertainty. And that comes out of the knowledge that you can't know everything, right? The things that you cannot see, I suppose. I mean, properly it's known as the unknown unknowns. And because they're unknown unknowns, per definition, you cannot put them in a matrix and you cannot calculate probabilities because you're dealing with an undefined sample space. And the thing is, when you're dealing with complexity, and this is something that it's a technical point, but it's an important one, you cannot collect enough data to define the sample space, right? And I can explain why if anyone is interested, but the point is, though, that many of the risks that you're dealing with in strategy are not the kinds of risks that you might be able to put into a matrix, if that makes sense. Again, this is speculation on my end. I think that strategists need to consider risk, but most of them, to your point, they don't, unfortunately.
Well, thanks, JP. And look, that makes a lot of sense. And look, strategy is a big thing here, and it's certainly getting a lot of momentum. So I suppose the second part of the question would be, just building on that, is when we talk about enterprise risk, do you think
Mhm.
it should be done as a separate exercise when the strategy is strategy is completed, or should it be crafted as you go through the process?
I mean, I think out of the two, I think it's something that you absolutely have to do as you go through the process when you do the strategies, so to speak. Because one, it's about the context in which you act, which is paramount anyway. But it also it can define certain constraints that you face, and that can be constraints that come out of certain forms of uncertainty. But it might sort of enforce, okay, so I'm going to make this choice and not that one, and whatever else. Again, when we're dealing with complexity, the thing is that we can't know a priori what's going to happen in the future. And that's something that I think any sane strategist has to take into account. So enterprise risk, building on my previous reply, I think it always should be a part of the conversation. And if it isn't, I think you're making a mistake as a strategist. You just don't expect it to don't expect to be able to define everything in its totality. Again, keep in mind that there are certain things that you can't know.
So in terms of what you've seen, in terms of companies you've dealt with, where do you see the biggest mistakes in the area of strategy or enterprise risk? That
I mean, the biggest thing for me is expecting the future to bear a strong resemblance to the past. And we see this in all kinds of companies, whether we're working in fintech or banks or whatever, basically. And part of it has to do with the Lucretius problem, which is that we think that the worst that has ever been is the worst that will ever be, or we just add a bit on top of it, and then we fail to recognize that something worse will come along. I mean, this was the case with, for example, the 2008 financial crisis. It was the case with the Fukushima power plant disaster, for example. But also it's because these days everything is quote unquote data driven, right? And data by nature is historical. There's no such thing as future data, right? It's all historical. And that means if every model that we use has to, in one way or another, assume that the future will bear a strong resemblance to the past. So we assume that markets will develop in the same way that they've always been, or that at least they've been in the sort of recent past. The competitors will behave in the same way, and whatever else. But also that we can identify points of brittleness in organizations, that we can establish beforehand where things go wrong, and so on and so forth. And what we see in reality, and all companies see this in reality, which sort of makes you wonder why they keep doing what they've always done. But change is, I suppose, it's not a contrast, it's a constant, right? So we see these effects all the time, whether we're dealing with innovation, financial markets, access to capital, supply lines, pandemics, wars, whatever. So whenever you do strategic planning or scenario planning, then the moment that you think you can predict with accuracy what's going to happen, and whether that's internally, externally, you're basically screwed. Well, usually anyway. And so I think you should look for patterns, not certainties, or even probabilities. And the problem again is when we rely too much on data, we think that we can predict the future, and that's never ever the case, basically.
so if the key part is that shared understanding of success, where does that come from? So is that in terms of, if I'm an average company, I'm looking to develop that shared understanding of success. Is it the insights I've got with customers? Is it making sure I've got a good diverse group of people that are coming to that conversation? Because a lot of them will be a board that will spend 2 days off site to come up with some of this. What is that process that could be, and is it over a period of time? What does that look like?
The dull answer is that it depends, because if to take two extremes, right? So if you're a strategist and you work with an organization, it can be either a greenfield project or a brownfield project. So it can either be a project that is, you're starting from scratch. I've done that as well. I've helped clients go from starting the company to eventually selling it. And then, you can establish what the shared understanding of success is very easily because the founder's there. And you just, okay, so this is what it's going to be, and then you move on. If you're dealing with a brownfield project, in other words, you're dealing with an ongoing concern, it's slightly different. It depends on how long the company has been around, what documentation there is, and so on and so forth. But you can usually establish it by just interviewing people and getting a sense for what it might be. There are ways of collecting that information in an organization. But crucially, what I think you shouldn't do, and there are many reasons why, is to do the sort of the strategy retreat. Strategy retreats are great if you're in the C-suite because it allows you to, go to some nice mansion somewhere and you have nice wine and nice food and a nice cigar, and you play around a couple of rounds of golf, and then you bring in Bob from accounting and you ask them how much the revenue was last year, and then you put 5% on top of that, and that's your strategy for the year, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I like that stuff too. It's just, it's not strategy. And so, you need to take into account what the organization already knows and what the people are doing at the moment. And sometimes when we're dealing with managers, they have this way of looking at the organizations as if sort of employees are unable to see the forest for the trees. But the problem is that if you're high up the organization, you sometimes fail to see the trees for the forest, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And again, there are ways of doing that, and you can use certain techniques to bring that information to the fold and whatever else. But yeah, you need to speak to everyone. It's not just the managers. And also, by the way, you can't just bring a bunch of head ofs into a room, because at best, I suppose, you're going to get a bunch of incentives that are aligned, but no one sort of at the periphery will share those incentives. And at worst, you're just going to get a lot of egos clashing, and you won't get anything done. So it's better to actually use constraints. So one of the things that I do, for example, is I'll get a bunch of people in a room together, and might be one person from the C-suite, one from finance, one from marketing, someone with a weird degree, and someone who hasn't been with the organization for more than 6 months, because that means they're going to bring a fresh perspective or whatever else. But yeah, you need diversity, absolutely.
Yeah, so the diversity of thinking being the most important thing is you're talking about there, and experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of it. Again, the sort of if you're just dealing with the shared understanding of success, it tends to be an emergent phenomenon anyway. So you need a lot of data. But if you're trying to actually then break it down and tackle it, and maybe even build a strategy, then you absolutely need diversity of thought. It's one of the things that few people have figured out. One of the sort of quote unquote tricks that I do with clients is I predict their competitors' movements. And it's not that hard really, because oftentimes the conventional approach to strategy is you get the smartest people in a room together. And by smartest, you mean the people who've gone to the same schools and they've read the same books and they have the same backgrounds, if we're honest. Most of them are white, middle-class people. And that means that their strategies are going to be quite predictable, right? Because I've read those books too. And I know the authors. If you're predictable, then you create a kind of weakness in strategy. You can do things like, for example, if you're working, this is something that a friend of mine did. I would never recommend this myself, of course, hypothetically speaking, but so dealing with, for example, construction, right? So they would publicly go after certain products that they didn't really want because they were just impossible to make profitable, and then all their competitors thought, oh shit, we need to go after those projects, and then they pulled out, and then their competitors were stuck with long ass, really unprofitable big projects that made sense to neither man nor beast, and then they could do a bunch of other things. But again, predictability is dangerous in strategy.
And the other thing I see often, there's a stat in the Institute of Directors which said that I think something like 60% of boards feel that they should be spending more time on strategy at their meetings, but they don't. And I suppose one of the questions is, how often should strategy be reviewed? Is it a continuous? If it's continuous, what does that look like? And I suppose a follow-up question around why aren't people spending more time on strategy when they know it's what they should be doing?
It's a good question. I mean, the first part of that is, how often do you adjust your strategy essentially? And if you're if you're doing a proper adaptive strategy, something like ABCDE, it will adjust itself along the way. That's kind of the point, right? And it will work across all time horizons. But you need to ensure that, whatever kind of strategy you do, you need to ensure that you have some kind of feedback loop. You need to be able to track your progress. Now, whatever metrics you use or however you do that, well, again, depends, but you need to be able to track progress. One of the problems that people have there is they over rely on things like plans, and then they have strategic objectives, and they think that progress equals whether you're hitting those objectives or not, and that's very short-sighted and narrow. I think you need to think slightly bigger than that. In terms of why companies aren't doing more strategy, I think, to be perfectly honest, is because there aren't that many really good strategic frameworks out there. There's some, but one of the things that was very revealing when I was writing the book, which I'm doing at the moment, was I really dug deep into strategic management doctrine and history, and sort of tried to figure out where it all came from. And what I realized very early on was that there was not a whole lot of evidence to support any of it. I mean, people were just lying through their teeth, and they're coming up all kinds of things to sell their services to clients. And as a result, I think that strategy has become detached from reality. Conventional strategy has a lot to do with the world as we would like it to be, not necessarily the world as it is. And that's problematic. There's that old saying of, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is, right? And that's one of the things. But another thing, a last thing, I think, is that a lot of companies struggle with strategy because they don't really know how to work with strategy, don't know what it is. They don't have any tools. They don't have the requisite knowledge. They have, even if they have MBAs on their staff, it's, again, they've read Porter and Mintzberg and a couple others, but it doesn't really translate into anything that they can work with in practice, which is why they instead bring consultants in, and that's just opening Pandora's box oftentimes. But
you mentioned ABCDE framework. Can you explain that simply in terms of what that is?
I mean, I can give you some of it. All of it will be in the new book, so I can't give too much away because we haven't released everything, and not everything is official yet. But in short, the ABCDE framework is, I think, anyway, I can say this. I think it's the world's first strategic framework that's built specifically for adaptive strategy. And what makes it unique, in a sense, is that most strategic frameworks that you will be able to find are kind of built on new knowledge being shoehorned into old models and outdated modes of thinking. Even the sort of the more avant-garde things tend to be based in the same underlying fallacies. And ABCDE is different because it's built entirely around new knowledge. So not only things like economics and strategic management doctrine, but also we use laws from physics and cognitive neuroscience and evolutionary biology and complexity science and whatever else. And what's really good about ABCDE, I think, I mean, obviously I'm partial, but I think that what's really good about it is that if you take a very simple model, like the McKinsey 7S model, for example, right? The theory is very simple. It's just like, oh, it's 7S, so you put this strategy here and this, that. Okay, so how do you do that in practice? Well, it turns out it's really, really hard. And that's often the case with a lot of these models and frameworks. It's really easy on paper. It's very, very difficult in practice. The ABCD framework is slightly, I suppose, in a sense, the opposite. So it's the theory is really, really advanced, but it's extremely easy to work with in practice. And the best thing is you don't need to understand the theory to work with it. I mean, you need to understand the theory and where it all comes from if you're going to teach it. But if you just want to pick it up and start using it on Monday, it's really easy to work. And as a result, I think it works really well. I mean, the first time I used it for a client, and yes, it's an ongoing thing, and you're just part of it, and but with that caveat in mind, we made the client $5 billion in a year.
Wow.
And I think that's a decent result. I mean, they were quite happy. Unfortunately, I didn't get a percentage of that. Would have been nice. But that was the first time I was just like, okay, so maybe there is something to this, and then we built on top of it, and everything will be in the book, right? So we'll have the theory and the stuff, but you can skip it if you don't want to. And then in the practice bit, you get the framework, but you also get all of the exercises and, again, techniques and tools and tips and whatever else. So you can just pick it up and start using it on Monday. And the reason why we're being so explicit about everything is because some companies, I won't say who, but you can probably figure out who it is, right? Some companies that are significantly larger than most other companies and work within the space have starting to sort of try to figure out what we're doing. One of them asked my co-author to teach them how we do this. And so we need to sort of get it out there before they start, selling the same thing basically and screwing it up as well.
Just on that one, JP, and you mentioned consultants before. Look, I'm a consultant, I have to admit, but I think consultancy's come a long way where there seems to be a different level of thinking. There seems to be, as you said before, consultancies now wanting to learn more, really to get an advantage. And I've been there before. I've been helping consultancies so they can just make more money. And there's a lot of different experiences with consultants on the ground, from very limited to experience. So when we're talking about strategy and risk management, or strategy or risk management, what do you think the role of an advisor, external, being consultant, or indeed maybe internal, should be?
I think that the role of an advisor, I mean, it varies. Sometimes you have to play the fool, so to speak, and you have to ask dumb questions or whatever else. But ultimately, I think it's to kind of provide an outsider's view, or I suppose whatever expertise is unavailable within the organization, and then you make sure it's valuable. And by which I mean, to be clear, that it's valuable to the company, not the consultancy. And there is a really interesting point here, which is to say that, and I think you're absolutely right, by the way, when we're dealing with, in terms of clients, if I'm representing a client or whatever else, we as companies, we're dealing with consultants, right? There's sometimes a point to working with smaller consultancies and smaller outfits because they have more skin in the game. And what I mean by that is that consultancies, large consultancies, are one of few businesses where you don't buy what they're selling, they will sell you what you're buying, right? And today, that's the illusion of control. Steve likes to call them merchants of certainty, but that's basically what it is. And what consultancies love above all else at the moment, and have done for quite a long time, is to sell you a big bet, right? And they kind of say, well, as long as you make this big bet, right, success is all but guaranteed. It never is, of course, but that's beside the point. Again, we like this illusion of certainty, and no one has ever gotten fired for hiring McKinsey, and so the saying goes, even though it's blatantly untrue, and I know that from experience. But here's the thing, right? And this is the thing that the people don't consider, or companies don't consider. These large consultancy outfits, they have a crap ton of clients, right? And they can afford a client going bust. For that client, however, the game kind of ends. I mean, technically speaking, this is a point about ergodicity, but to put it in, I suppose, as sort of a metaphor, let's say, right? So there's a massive difference between betting on people playing Russian roulette and actually playing Russian roulette, right? So if you're betting on others, the odds of winning are always going to be 5 out of 6. So essentially, you stand to go home rich and happy, right? But if you're the one holding the gun, right, eventually you're going to have a hole in your head. So the presence of sort of potentially catastrophic failure doesn't mean you shouldn't take any risks. I mean, not taking risks is in and of itself risky, right? But you should always, as a company, you should always remember that there's a massive difference between being a gambler and being the gamble, right? And this is especially true when people tell you to make big bets. And yes, for anyone thinking about it, same applies to venture capitalists looking to invest in your company. But when you're evaluating, a consultant, treat them as if you would treat, I don't know, an engineer. Ask them if they want to make a big bet. Let's try that with my teeth in. Why? What are they basing it on? What happens if you fail? Do you look at enterprise risk? Bringing it back to that. Do you consider all of those things? And if they can't answer those questions, and if whoever's tasked with executing can't answer those questions, because God knows we often get the senior pitch team and the junior delivery team, right? Then you should perhaps look at a different consultant. And there are really good consultants out there, to your point.
Thank you.
So you've completed the strategy. You want to try and connect that with the organisation, and obviously you can't involve everyone in the organisation with the shared understanding. So you talked about getting that shared understanding success. What are the, and I know a lot of companies will just present that to employees and hope that they'll imbibe it. What's your experience in terms of how you create that ongoing shared sense of understanding within the organisation?
It depends on how I do it. So establishing a shared understanding of success essentially creates that direction. And then the next thing you want to do is to set the outer limits of what is permissible. And what I mean by that is, if you take traditional strategic planning, it's kind of like drawing a line in the sand. You tell everyone to stand on that line. And then they spend a lot of time and resource trying to get back whenever they've been pushed off. What you want to do is instead you create two lines in the sand and you say, okay, so you can adapt and you can move in that direction, but it needs to be between these two lines. And what that tends to do is that it tends to enable people to actually adapt to circumstances and sort of understand the way in which they need to go without necessarily knowing all the bits and bobs and details and whatever else. I mean, they should do anyway, because it's sort of, a strategy should be simple to understand. It shouldn't be a War and Peace style document. It should be a page. But it's basically that, right? If you have a strategy that is, the success of that strategy hinges on your ability to tell everyone what they need to do, then I think you have an issue. Because, well, let's be honest, if you're a CEO, right, chances are you probably won't know what everyone needs to do. If you're a management consultant, you will not know what everyone needs to do. I can guarantee that. And then ideally, and again, it depends on the context and whatever else, but what you want to do is sort of, you just kind of drip feed it. So you try to get people to start working with it. Certain things you want to announce, yes, but what you don't want to do is sort of, tell everyone what they need to do, and this is the big strategy, and this is, everything going forward, everything's going to change, and whatever else, with sort of a lot of pomp and circumstance. Because what tends to happen then is, there's this thing called, in cognitive neuroscience, it's called conceptual blending. But what it means is, when you make decisions as a human, you don't go for a best fit pattern match. You go for a first fit pattern match. In other words, when someone announces a transformation product or a new strategy and whatever else, you immediately measure or sort of compare it to similar events they've experienced. And that's why transformation projects fail. Because, why would you change your strategy? Well, you change it because it's not working, right? So you need to be careful about how you do that. Usually telling everyone to do things differently won't work. They'll just revert back to what they were doing previously.
Yeah, and that's we had a guy called Dr. Jason Fox on.
Jason, yeah,
talks highly of you, and he talked about the role of hypothesis and test and learns. So yeah, which I really like the sound of. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the importance of that in strategy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, I kind of alluded to it before, but when we're dealing with complexity, we cannot know what will happen. So therefore, we need to prod the environment, right? And so strategy is a matter of what's called praxis. So not practice, but praxis, which is theory-informed practice. So that means you start with a hypothesis, which is an educated guess, essentially, and then you execute, and then you learn from that and learn from the feedback, and then you update the theory, and then you execute again, and then you learn from, and so on and so forth, right? And so you need a theoretical understanding, because if you don't know the theory, if you don't understand why something works, you won't be able to scale it. But you also need to be humble enough to sort of update that knowledge, right? So where I see a lot of companies go wrong is when they create, it's typically a plan, and they create a plan, it's based on this idea of certain knowledge, right? And that's dangerous for two reasons. Firstly, because that's never the case. You won't know for certain what's going to happen in the future, regardless how much data you have, as I kind of explained before. But also, when you're confident in your abilities, when you think that you know, you tend to discount change and signals of anomalies. That eventually comes back to bite you in the ass. And then what happens is, well, something that you hadn't planned for, the sort of the strategy / plan doesn't work. Your theory fails to match reality. And then what people do for some reason is, rather than change the plan or the theory, they try to change reality, right? And that never, ever, ever works. So I mean, with Jason is great anyway, but you need to sort of try stuff out, and you need to adapt and learn. Of course, I mean, in any organization, you're going to have certain things that you kind of know how they work, right? A kind of main revenue stream, or what David Woods would call the competence envelope. But then you also need to have adaptive capacity outside of that. Now, the challenge, I suppose, is that those things, there are tensions between them. And if we talk about risk, for example, right? So we know that risk management is really important, and it allows us to adapt to change and handle risks and challenges, and sometimes opportunities, because risk can also can carry a certain upside, at least if you listen to certain people. But let's say that we're in an organization where all these risks that we have identified, they never materialize, right? Do we still keep investing into those kinds of capabilities when we are under pressure to become more efficient? And oftentimes people go, well, actually, no, because these guys, it's like, the boy who cried wolf, right? And of course, what happens ultimately is that thing materializes, then you're screwed. So you need to manage those tensions. You need to manage the kind of stuff that you feel comfortable with, the kind of stuff that you know, quote unquote, know how it works, with all the other stuff, the stuff that you don't know, all the uncertainty and whatever else. And when you're dealing with whatever else, then adaptive capacity, a part of that is experimentation. It has to be, because again, you can't know.
Yeah, cool. And I'll finish with one last question, which is,
yep,
basically anyone listening here, what's the one thing they can go away and do that would increase their chances of their strategy succeeding?
So regardless of size, I suppose, the big thing I think is humility. Don't see your strategy as something set in stone. Consider it more like it's drawn in mud, for example, right? And that's not the same thing as not committing to whatever it is that you believe in. Just, you need to continuously vet that belief against reality. And the point of the exercise, again, to sort of wrap it all up, is for strategy is to move the organization in a wanted direction of the desired speed. It's not to identify every single step to take, so long as you before you take them. And if you want to do that in practice, start with the two whys. I don't mean that in the sort of bullshit Simon Sinek way. What I mean is, the first why is the why of existence. So why does your company exist in the first place, and why would anyone care, right? And the other is the why of movement. So why is it that we're moving in this direction? And if you understand those things, and you start thinking about your shared understanding of success and whatever else, then you're on your way. Just to start with the basics, and by doing the basics, because few companies do the basics right, then you're going to have a competitive advantage, and then you can go from there. And I think that, by the way, I think that's true for risk as well. Do the basics first, and then the other stuff.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you, JP, and thank you, David, from RiskNZ for your time and expertise. Again, I think nearer the time when your book comes out, we'd love to publicise it for you. I'm certainly going to get a copy. So what to do when you don't know what to do?
Yep.
By JP and Steve McCrone.
Yes.
If you weren't on if you weren't on the beginning, some of the key things I took out were really that shared understanding of success and being able to measure that shared understanding of success as you go along, enabling the synchronization of units within your organization, so making sure everyone's moving in the same direction. And then I love that the finish in terms of the 2 whys. Why do we exist, and why do we want to move in this direction? But also, I think the other key thing is that humility. So, too many people don't have that, where they don't want to admit that what they're doing is not right, or they're not going in the right direction. So having that humility to say, actually, we're moving in this, but we'll test and learn, and then we'll see what we'll learn from that, and then we'll move in slightly different direction. So that's fantastic. If you weren't on at the beginning, I just wanted to say with Govern 365 are running an initiative called Pay It Forward, where we're helping charities governance free for a year, getting corporates to contribute 50%, and we'll pay the other 50%. So if you know any corporates or sponsors or charities that want to go through that, let me know. I'll put in the link again. But just to say, once again, thank you, JP. And it's late at night for you. Really appreciate your time. It's been fantastic, and I love anyone who's we'll put JP's details. He does a blog that he sends out weekly, which I subscribe to. Some great questions and some great people that he talks to, and some great information that it will help you in terms of your strategy going forward. So thank you very much. Have a good night, rest of your night, and thanks, David.
Thank you.